Jazz, an American original. People in the 1920s were crazy about jazz. In fact, the 1920s are sometimes called the Jazz Age. Today, many people call jazz America's most original art form. The roots of jazz are in New Orleans, down in Louisiana at the mouth of the Mississippi River. New Orleans had and has an unusual mixture of peoples. The city was settled by the French in 1718. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson bought New Orleans as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The French language stuck. Some of the sounds and words of that language can be heard in New Orleans even today. Many of the French and Spanish men who came to New Orleans in the 18th century married African American women. Their biracial children, called Creoles, often spoke French or Spanish as well as English. Out of the souls of New Orleans and the mixed heritage of its people, a new music arose. It was called jazz, and it was uniquely American music, unlike anything heard in the world before. It combined the rhythm and drum beat of Africa with the instruments and heritage of Europe. It added a dash from the spirituals of the Black Protestant churches and much from the talents of some Black musical geniuses who could be heard in street bands and nightclubs. In the 1920s, jazz began to spread, first to Chicago, then across the country, and then around the world. Below, we have Louis Armstrong, and we have this image here. Many of the early jazz leaders, such as Joe King Oliver, the back row on cornet was his Creole jazz band, where trumpeters, probably because the trumpet could be played while marching and because it was high, its sweet high sound carried over the street noise. Kneeling front is Louis Armstrong. The best way to learn about jazz is to listen to it. You could start with one of the greatest jazz performers, Louis Armstrong. Louis grew up poor in New Orleans, then someone gave him a trumpet. He was born to play the trumpet. People began calling him Satchel Mouth because his cheeks seemed to hold a suitcase full of air. Satchmo was soon playing on riverboats that went up and down the Mississippi. Then he went to Chicago and began making history. Satchmo had a big grin, but when he played the trumpet, he closed his eyes and blew clear, heavenly tones. No two jazz performances are exactly alike. Composers who compose European style music write down notes and expect musicians to play those notes just as they are written. That isn't so true in jazz. An important part of jazz is improvisation. Improvisation. Improvising means doing your own thing. Jazz musicians talk to each other with their instruments. It is something like African drum talk. One musician leads with a theme, then someone answers that theme. He plays the theme his own way. Then maybe the first musician improvises with another variation on the theme. Soon the whole band is playing with it. It isn't easy to do it well. In New York City in the late 1920s, jazz provided the soundtrack to nightlife in Harlem. As the popular Cotton Club crowds danced to the music of Duke Ellington's band, but the club was segregated. The customers were white, the musicians black. Some African American musicians went to Europe, especially to Paris, where they joined a colony of writers and artists. All were part of a cultural movement where creative talent mattered more than anything else. Everyone in Paris seemed to be listening to jazz. George Gershwin, who was there, put a jazz beat into his groundbreaking An American in Paris. Gershwin and Aaron Copland, called Dean of American Composers, studied with France's great music teacher, Nadia Boulanger.